we've been going through as a church family this year. And this week is focused on the Sermon on the Mount. We've been spending a couple of weeks, and we'll spend a couple more weeks focused on the Sermon on the Mount. But this week is focused on prayer in the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, Jesus gives us the model prayer in that sermon. And Brother Billy Smith has walked us through a little bit of that section, what it means, and how we can better enrich our prayer lives. And he ends with this idea of praying submissively. And he focuses in on the line in the Sermon on the Mount where it says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." And it's interesting how that's how Jesus says we should start off our prayers, with first acknowledging God, but then saying, "May your will be done." And of course, we can see that lived out, as Brother Billy points out, in Jesus' life, most evidently in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Billy kind of walks us through a little bit of what the Garden of Gethsemane meant, what it was like in that time for Jesus, a time of sorrow and anguish, where we can really feel what's going on in that time, and trying to understand what's going on in the garden in Matthew chapter 26 is it's almost like trying to understand weightlifting, right? If you look at me, obviously I'm not much of a weightlifter, but and when we look at, especially if I look at the champion weightlifters, right, they're lifting these huge rocks and carrying planes and fire trucks on their back, and we can try to, we have commentators who are saying like how much weight these guys are carrying, how much weight they're picking up. We can talk about how much weight, we can even describe or tell you how much weight exactly they're carrying, but until we actually pick up those rocks or carry those planes that those guys are carrying, we can't really understand the enormous weight that is being put on those guys. And I feel like that's a little bit of what's going on in the garden. We can't truly understand what's going on in the garden, the weight that Jesus is feeling, because we've never had to go through that position. Many people have tried to write commentaries, written sermons, talked about what it means for Jesus in this moment to bear the sins of the world. But truly, I mean, we can look back into the Bible and try to come up with parallels, but we can't really describe or even fathom the weight that's being put on Jesus right here in this story in Matthew chapter 26. And but one way to hopefully understand it a little bit is to look back in the Old Testament, what it says about sin. And this overarching theme in the Old Testament is that sin has to be paid for. If you look and go through the book of Leviticus and all the sacrificial laws, it all talks about there's sin, Israel sins, and that sin has to be paid for somehow. And the prophet Hosea kind of goes through this idea as well. God comes to Hosea, and he tells him to prophesy to Israel. But before he does that, he makes him do a couple of things, which is kind of weird and not familiar with all the prophets. Of course, Isaiah does something crazy where he walks around in the city with no clothes, and it's kind of weird. And Hosea is kind of called to do another similar thing, where his life is to symbolize the life and the relationship between Israel and God. And God comes to Hosea, and he tells him that he's going to go marry a wife who's a sinner, known for sinning, an adulterous woman. And we don't know if she was this way before they married or after they married, but we just know Hosea knows the character of this woman before they're married. And so he goes and he marries this woman who eventually cheats on him, and is this adulterous woman. And their relationship is just torn apart. And it's shown to represent the relationship between God and his people, Israel. And this idea that they were in this covenant relationship back on Mount Sinai, but Israel, through worshiping idols and worshiping false gods, have separated themselves from God. And that's played out in Hosea's life. But then you get to chapter 3 in Hosea, And God comes to him, and he tells him that he's to go back and take back Gomer, his wife. And so he goes, and Gomer's in this place where this life of adultery is continued to take up, and he goes and he takes her out of that life. But what's he kind of keys in on chapter 3 in Hosea is that there's a price that had to be paid to get her out of that situation. Gomer had put herself in this situation with her sin, and Hosea had to pay a price to bring her out of that. And so he does that. He brings her out, and then they're reunited again. And that whole story is showed to be a parallel between God and Israel, of course. But it can also key us in a little bit on what's happening. In the book of John, Jesus comes on the scene, and you have this guy named John the Baptist, and he says, makes this wild proclamation early in the book of John where he says, "The Lamb of God, here to take away the sins of the world." And they didn't know exactly how that was going to happen. They knew that the Messiah, the Lamb of God, he was going to take away the sins of the world, but how that was going to be done, we have no idea until we get to Matthew chapter 26, right? Where we see in the garden Jesus talking about this cup of wrath, which in the Old Testament constantly talks about the wrath of God that was being filled up, and we have Jesus here bearing that cup, and he says in Matthew chapter 26, "My Father, if it is possible," in verse 39, "let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And the gravity of that statement, just again, we can't fathom. But this idea of all the sins and the price that had to be paid for all the world and our separation from God now comes down to Jesus, and he says, "Man, if this cup can pass from me, somehow let it be done. But nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." And so, how do we approach our Gethsemane, right? There are multiple times where we feel alone. In this story in Matthew chapter 26, the writer constantly tries to portray the isolation of Jesus. And he says that he separates from his disciples with the 3 disciples, but then he goes even further away from them, pounding on this isolation of Jesus. And I know that there are times that I've felt, I know that there are times that we feel isolated from the people around us, even from God at times. Maybe we feel like man, I don't feel you there. I just feel alone. I feel separated. How do we approach those times? And of course, it's easy to talk about it while I'm standing in the middle of a church building, but it gets a lot harder when I'm actually in those moments, right? When I'm actually feeling that isolation. How do we approach our Gethsemane? And hopefully we can take time to look at this prayer, Jesus, look at this moment that Jesus is in, and be able to model after him of being, even in the midst of grief and anguish, being able to say, "Not my will, but your will be done, Father." The gravity of that statement can't be explained, but hopefully we can live in a way that no matter where we are, we can say, "Not my will, God, but your will be done." We hope you had a great week. I hope you're going to have a great weekend. We'd love to have you here on Sunday if you have the chance. But as always, if there's anything we can pray for, maybe you're right now in your Gethsemane and you just need someone there, let us know. Contact the church office, contact our ministers, our elders especially, and let us know how we can help. And we'll be there to pray for you and to be there when you need it. Thank you very much, and hope you have a great rest of the day.